Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to track the absolutely wild evolution of a Philippine monster known as the Aswang. We're going to see exactly how this thing went from a deeply rooted spiritual belief to a literal psychological weapon used in war, and finally, to a modern movie trope. It's a fascinating ride, so let's get into it.
Right off the bat, I want to hook you with this incredibly gripping historical anecdote from the 1950s. Picture this. You've got a patrol of communist Hukabalop rebels, usually just called the Hooks, and they're camped out on a heavily fortified hill in the Philippines. One night, a rebel goes missing. His unit retraces their steps, and they actually find his lifeless body right there on the trail. But there's a chilling detail. On his neck are two distinct puncture wounds, and his body is entirely drained of blood. Terrified by local rumors of a bloodthirsty monster called the Aswang, that entire rebel group abandons their stronghold within a single day. So how on earth did a mythical monster defeat an armed rebellion? Well, spoiler alert, it didn't.
The so-called monster was actually a highly classified, incredibly elaborate four-step psychological warfare operation. It was masterminded by Edward Geary Lansdale, who was a CIA operative and a U.S. Air Force general. The plan was almost like a dark movie plot. First, Lansdale's team quietly planted Aswang rumors in the surrounding towns. Then, they simply waited and ambushed the very last man in a rebel patrol. Step 3, they punctured his neck and literally drained his blood. And finally, Step 4, they left the body right back on the trail for his terrified friends to find.
You see, Lansdale didn't view local folklore with the kind of smug disdain that a lot of Westerners did at the time. No, he saw it as a low-budget, highly effective tactical opportunity. He actually once noted that a whole new approach opens up when one thinks of Psy-War in terms of playing a practical joke. By taking the time to understand what genuinely terrified the local populace, he was able to clear out a heavily armed rebel encampment without fighting a single-pitch battle. It's kind of mind-blowing.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because to really understand how Lansdale pulled this off so perfectly, we need to put on our historian's hat and trace the chronological evolution of this specific spiritual belief. We're going to start way back, between 300 and 900 CE with early Hindu and Javanese influences. Then we'll move through Spanish colonization in the 1500s, hit that Hukab rebellion in the 1950s, and finally land on how it's portrayed in modern cinema in 2012.
So, starting right at the beginning, the origins of the Aswang myth are actually deeply rooted in pre-colonial animist beliefs. During those early migrations, Hindu and Javanese cultures introduced these concepts of flesh-eating spirits and demons, like the Rakshasas. But originally, in these early Southeast Asian traditions, this type of viscera-sucking creature wasn't even gendered. It didn't look like a human at all. It often took the form of an animal, maybe a bird or a dog, that basically posed a supernatural threat to young children.
But before we look at how that specific myth morphed over time, we really need to introduce a crucial figure in ancient Philippine society, the Babaylan. The Babaylan were these highly respected, incredibly powerful female shamans, midwives, healers, and essentially the leaders of their communities. They were the spiritual and medical backbone of their society, holding immense, unquestioned power and influence over daily life. Everything changed, though, when Spanish colonizers and Catholic missionaries arrived in the 1500s. To successfully convert the population and establish their own authority, the Spanish realized they had to strip that immense power away from the Babaylan. So what did they do? They deliberately inverted the role of these respected indigenous healers. They took that ancient non-gendered myth of the flesh-eating spirit and forcefully merged it with their own European concepts of witches. In the public eye, they transformed the revered Babaylan into a demonized, viscera-sucking witch.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how specifically and intentionally these monstrous traits were engineered. The Spanish missionaries started claiming that the Aswang drained fetuses right from the womb and explicitly targeted pregnant women. Think about that for a second. It is a direct, grotesque inversion of the Babaylan's traditional role as a life-bringing midwife. The new myth also claimed the Aswang literally severed her upper torso from her lower half when she flew in the dark. Scholars point out this was a very deliberate conceptual way to separate the woman from her sexual organs, which served to enforce strict Catholic gender roles and heavily punish female independence. Historical records show us that this manipulation wasn't an accident. It was actively weaponized by missionaries. This was heavily driven by the colonial belief in racial and cultural superiority at the time. By transforming the most powerful, respected women in the society into literal monsters that people were terrified of, the colonizers successfully dismantled indigenous religious structures and enforced strict compliance to their own colonial rule. Okay, so let's fast forward with me back to the Cold War era of the 1950s. The Philippines is now an independent nation, but it's facing a massive internal conflict. Enter the Hukbalahap, or the Huks. They were communist guerrilla rebels engaged in a fierce fight against the Philippine government. At this time, public support for the government was actually incredibly low due to widespread corruption, and the Huks were gaining some serious, threatening ground.
And this is exactly where Edward Lansdale comes back into our story. While the Huk rebels were using very conventional communist propaganda, dropping mass leaflets and shouting political slogans like "land for the landless" and "bullets, not ballots," Lansdale bypassed those conventional pamphlets entirely. He leaned into highly unorthodox, culturally targeted psychological warfare. He manipulated local folklore, cranked up the rumor mills, and executed those incredibly dark, elaborate practical jokes we talked about.
Lansdale's success really stemmed from a completely different mindset than those early Spanish colonizers. He actively sought to understand rural superstitions without passing judgment on them. He worked side by side with Philippine Defense Secretary Ramon Magsaysay to actively create local Filipino heroes rather than just inserting Americans into the spotlight. Historians note that unlike earlier colonizers who operated from a white savior complex, Lansdale's tactics relied on viewing the locals as equals and truly integrating with the population to figure out what made them tick.
And this brilliantly illustrates a fascinating, almost funny irony about Lansdale's famous operation. The traditional Filipino aswang actually uses a long, tube-like tongue to slurp up viscera from the roof of a house. But Lansdale's fake monster? It left 2 distinct puncture wounds on the neck and drained the victim's blood. Those are traits that belong to a traditional European vampire, right? He didn't even get the myth exactly right. Yet because those rumors were so carefully and deliberately planted in the local villages, the psychological terror worked flawlessly anyway.
So, taking all this history into account, how is this heavily manipulated historical weapon consumed in our modern media today? For a perfect example, we can look at the 2012 Filipino film Corazon ang Unang Aswang, which translates to Corazon the First Aswang.
The movie is set, ironically enough, in the 1950s, the exact same era as Lansdale's Psy-War operation. The film tells the story of a woman named Corazon, who goes completely mad after delivering a stillborn baby. Tragic, right? She completely loses her religious faith, retreats deep into the forest, and eventually becomes this feral monster that hunts children. The movie explicitly frames her tragic transformation as the origin story of the very first aswang.
But critics noted something very telling about this modern adaptation. One review called it a grandiose romance draped in horror trappings. You see, the film focuses super heavily on the melodramatic romance between Corazon and her husband, and in doing so, it completely scrubs the myth of its original, heavy sociopolitical weight.
When you look at them side by side, the contrast is stark. Historically, the aswang was a calculated, gritty tool for political control, military psychological warfare, and the systematic, deliberate demonization of powerful indigenous women. But cinematically, today it's reduced to a sanitized, romanticized depiction of just a tragic victim of circumstance.
Furthermore, this modern cinematic representation is still, almost subconsciously, echoing that colonial, Catholic inversion of the myth. By focusing on a woman driven to madness and child-killing due to a loss of faith, modern pop culture is still heavily relying on the Spanish witch trope. The true ancient animist origins of the myth and the powerful Babylon are left buried in the past.
So the crucial point is this. The aswang is essentially a mirror, reflecting the agendas of whoever happens to be telling the story at the time. Across centuries, this piece of folklore has rarely been just a simple ghost story told around a fire. It has been a living, breathing apparatus. It's been used by colonizers to control a population, by military operatives to terrify an insurgency, and by modern media to entertain us on a Friday night.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. What modern myths or media tropes are currently being used to shape our socio-political landscape right now? The next time you consume a piece of media or hear a pervasive, scary rumor spreading around, it's definitely worth asking yourself, who is actually pulling the strings? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning what you see.